Good afternoon, or good evening. Good evening for most of us. Good afternoon for some folks. Once again, my name is Tasha Mitchell. I have a Master of Education and a Master of Divinity, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am going to be leading our workshop today called Disconnected, the Role of Mental Health in Cultivating Balanced Relationships. As I said, hopefully this workshop will be interactive. I know for folks watching later, this might not be as interactive, but we will have some parts in this presentation workshop that will be interactive. So hopefully we can learn together, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So what is the workshop objective for today? And I put this in the description. The ultimate goal for this workshop is for every participant to feel more empowered in their ability to navigate the complexity of relationships in their lives that are impacted by mental health concerns. So what do we mean here? Some questions to consider for our time together. So as I'm working through this workshop, through this presentation, and then as we sit and kind of talk together, there are some questions that I want us to consider and to keep in our minds. I forgot our little picture. So one of the questions, contemplative reflection. How much have my relationships been impacted by mental health? So something to consider as we continue to have our conversation. Practical application. I am a 1 on the Enneagram. I don't know how much you all know about the Enneagram. We will talk about it later in the presentation because I love it. I'm a 1 on the Enneagram. This is a part of the gut doing triad, which means I highly value learning that compels me to action. So we're going to have some practical application woven all throughout this workshop. So the practical application question that I want us all to consider as we continue to work through this again is, how do I see this playing out in my life? How do I incorporate it, right? It's great to sit here and come and listen and have a workshop, but it's even better to be able to think about, how can I actually apply this to my life? How do I see it showing up in my life? And then how can I take what I have learned and actually incorporate that into my life? So hopefully that sounds fair for everyone. And I can see a few faces. So I'll try to judge on based on what I can see from y'all's faces. So first things first, let's do an overview. So I'll give you an idea of what we're actually going to talk about in our workshop today. So one of the first things that we are going to talk about are some key definitions, concepts, and considerations. So we're going to talk about some key terms, kind of explore what is mental health, right? We all have an idea of mental health, but how do we actually define it? How do we define mental illness, mental health? And looking at some of these considerations, what are the considerations that we should have when we're actually having these conversations around mental health and relationships? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Questions about mental health and relationships. So I'm going to be pulling a lot from spirituality, religiosity, and then also psychology, and crafting some questions that we should think about as we continue in this conversation, right? As it pertains to our relationships. So specific types of relationships, what kind of questions should I consider when I'm reflecting on mental health in some of my relationships? We'll talk about specifics. So we'll talk about considerations for personal relationships and how that somewhat differs and overlaps with professional relationships, right? How do I approach mental health in both of these capacities? They can overlap and sometimes they are different. And so there's some different considerations. We'll also talk about identity. So some key considerations for identity. And then we will talk about some spirituality. That's actually flipped in the presentation. We'll do some activities. We'll go over some scenarios, and then we will have time for discussion. And I built in time for discussion throughout the presentation. So we will be able to stop and discuss some of these ahead of time. All right. Now, confidentiality and safety agreement. So this is one of the things that I would hope that we would all commit to as a psychotherapist. Confidentiality is very important to me. So just something to consider. So this is what I hope we can all commit to in this space when we do pause and have discussion. So together we'll acknowledge that both the topic and the nature of this workshop are inherently sensitive. As such, we commit to not disclosing any specific information shared by individuals with anyone outside of this workshop. Additionally, we agree to participate in discussions and activities to the degree that feels safe for us. No one will be asked to share anything beyond their comfort zone. Personal self-disclosures are welcome, but they're not mandatory. So feel free to participate as you are able and as you feel comfortable. Hopefully everyone is good with that. And then this is an important aspect in terms of our commitments for Q. I don't know if you wanted to go over these, Carrie?
Sure. So for folks who've come to these sessions in the past, these might look familiar. Essentially, these are 5 different ways that we kind of encourage everyone to behave together in these spaces. So the first one is stories stay and lessons leave. So what you learn, what your ahas are from the space, feel free to take that with you, to share that with friends and neighbors and whoever that feels right to share with. But the stories that are shared in the space stay in the space. When we're doing discussions, we encourage everyone to speak from the I and from your personal perspective. Across the session, we're going to encourage folks to practice your engagement. So if you are awesome at listening, we're going to encourage you to practice speaking. If you're awesome at speaking, we're going to encourage you to practice listening. We always encourage everyone in this learning spaces like this to be assuming best intent for your colleagues and the facilitators, and to embrace curiosity. And then just to remember that no one knows everything, and that together we know more. So remembering the value of multiple perspectives.
Okay, and with that, we will move forward. So a little bit about me. I thought that this was important because the About Me section for this particular presentation has a lot to do with why I'm coming and how I'm showing up in this presentation and where I am situating myself in this conversation. So a little bit about me. I've been connected to Q Christian Fellowship since 2015, back when it was GCN. I attended my first conference in Portland, Oregon, and I have since attended 6 conferences and have led 4 affinity gatherings. Some of them I have led with Darren. I'm also serving as a keynoter for this year's Parents and Families Summit here in Chicago. So I'm deeply connected to the work that Q does, and I appreciate and value the work that Q does, and so I wanted to participate. I'm coming from a personal perspective, not just an outsider, right? I've been deeply connected to the organization, and so I consider this a family and am a part of the community. So let's talk about my social location, where I'm coming from in this presentation. I am a womanist, pastoral theologian, psychotherapist, pastor, and doctoral student. So let's talk about some of these terms, right? Pastoral theology. Some of you may have heard of pastoral theology. Pastoral theology is an interdisciplinary field in theological studies that has traditionally sat at the intersection. Ooh, I think somebody's not muted.
You can see them. I'm not sure they can see you.
It happens. This happens all the time when I'm pastoring, so I understand. So it's traditionally sat at the intersection between psychology and religion or spirituality. So what does that mean for me? You might hear me start to preach a little bit because I sit at the intersection between religion and psychology. Literally, I serve as a pastor, as a psychotherapist, and again, as a doctoral student in a field that pulls all of this together. A better way of understanding pastoral theology is to understand it as a more broad conversation between the social sciences and the humanities. So what does it mean that I am a womanist? So womanist ideology, my definition, womanist ideology is a humanistic worldview that centers the experience and plight of Black women and girls in the fight for 1, social change against all forms of oppression globally, and 2, the flourishing of all creation. Some of you might have heard of Alice Walker. Alice Walker actually coins this term womanist. And she describes it as 1, a Black feminist, or a feminist of color, or 2, a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. She appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's flexibility, values tears as a natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength. There's another womanist theologian named Emily Towns, who's the dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, where I attended to get my MDiv. And she describes womanist theology as this: it's a form of reflection that places the religious and moral perspectives of Black women at the center of its method. Issues of class, gender, including sex, sexism, sexuality, and sexual exploitation, and race are seen as theological problems. The key for womanist theology is the use of an interstructured analysis that is both descriptive, meaning we pay attention to an analysis and a socio-historical perspective of Black life and Black religious worldviews, but it's also prescriptive, meaning we offer suggestions for the eradication of oppression in the lives of African Americans and by extension, the rest of humanity and creation. This is why I say it's deeply humanist. It's concerned with the flourishing and the thriving of all creation, but recognizing from a theological perspective that Jesus calls us to care for the least of these. And at least from a womanist perspective, the least of these are those who have bodies that are both Black and feminine, or deemed to be feminine. I also have a personal stake in this topic. Why is this important to me? Well, one, because I have a personal history with mental illness and learning and a learning disability, right? So I'm coming from a place of I literally have had personal impact by mental illness. I have suffered from depression and anxiety for many, many years, depression since I was a teenager, insomnia since I was a teenager, and I was diagnosed with anxiety, started having panic attacks in my early adulthood. So this is deeply personal for me, right? As a psychotherapist, but someone who's impacted by it. And I have a diagnosed learning disability that I discovered when I was 34 years old, which is very disorienting to find out when you're 34. And then, of course, the elevated significance for the pandemic, right? We're all impacted by this because the pandemic has kind of heightened the significance for this. We're talking personal, pastoral, and psychotherapeutic implications for this. Just thinking about, I'm sure we can all reflect on how the pandemic has impacted our mental health, how it's impacted the mental health of those around us, and then how that has impacted us in return. So that's a little bit about me and how I am coming to this presentation, this workshop today. So we will move on to key definitions and concepts. So I wanted to kind of break this down. There's a couple of different ways we can approach, right? But I wanted to talk about some of the key concepts that we're talking about today, because we hear mental health, we hear all of these words, and we're like, we kind of have an idea of what it means, but sometimes we have a hard time defining it. So I want to break this down into understanding the difference between mental health and mental illness. They are correlated, but they are not the same thing. So let's talk about mental health. So according to mentalhealth.gov, mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. I found this excellent excerpt regarding mental health from the World Health Organization, and it's a little bit lengthy, but it really puts into perspective what mental health actually is and how it functions, and that should help us in this conversation. This is how the World Health Organization describes it. Mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. It is an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. Mental health is a basic human right. That is a key component. Mental health is a basic human right, and it is crucial to personal, community, and socioeconomic development. Mental health is more than the absence of mental health disorders. It exists on a complex continuum, which is experienced differently from one person to the next. We can have the same diagnosis and still experience it differently, with varying degrees of difficulty and distress and potentially very different social and clinical outcomes. So once again, two people can have depression and experience it very differently. And we'll look at some of the ways that that could be impacted based on like identity, intersectionality, and a number of other different things, right? So it's a very wide umbrella when we talk about mental health and all of the aspects of our lives that it impacts. Mental health conditions include mental disorders and psychosocial disabilities, as well as other mental states associated with significant distress, impairment in functioning, or risk of self-harm. So that's how we're going to understand and kind of define mental health. Now let's talk about how that relates to mental illness, which is defined separately. So the National Institute of Mental Health defines it in two different ways. So they talk about any mental health illness is defined as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. AMI can vary in impact, ranging from no impairment to mild, moderate, or even severe impairment. Serious mental illness is defined as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. The American Psychiatric Association has this to say about mental illness. Mental illnesses are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, or a combination of these. Mental illnesses can be associated with distress and or problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. And just to demystify mental illness, it's actually very common. The American Psychiatric Association estimates that almost 20% of adults in the United States have been diagnosed with an actual mental illness. So that's 1 in 5 adults. So we're not talking about a boogeyman in the closet. We're talking about something that is impacting a large swath of the population, probably impacting people that we love, that we care about, impacting ourselves, which is why we showed up today. A key consideration for mental illness is diagnosis. Mental illnesses are classified and diagnosable mental health conditions. Again, this falls under mental health, but mental illness and mental health are not necessarily the same thing. Mental illnesses are things that can be classified and diagnosed. I am a psychotherapist. I use the DSM to classify and diagnose illnesses when I'm working with clients. Another consideration for this term when we talk about mental illness is the fact that it is seen pejoratively and is highly stigmatized in our society. So one of the things that I want us to consider is that we have to be mindful of the language we use when we refer to mental health and when we hear other people refer to their mental health, right? So if they're referring it to mental health and we say, oh, your mental illness, right? We have to be really careful about how other people are defining their mental health because of the stigma and the consequences that are attached to saying something like mental illness. So those are some of the distinctions between mental health and mental illness that are crucial for our conversation. So what are some other considerations for framing our conversation today? I want to talk about a couple things. Empathy is one, including this term that I coined called hermeneutical empathy. When we talk about some of these considerations, I want us to consider these from both sides of the equation, our own mental health and the mental health of others. So consider these as we're approaching it from my mental health perspective and the mental health perspective of another person. Psychology today defines empathy as the ability to recognize, understand, and share the thoughts and feelings of another person, animal, or fictional character. Developing empathy is crucial for establishing relationships and behaving compassionately. It involves experiencing another person's point of view rather than just one's own. And it enables pro-social or helping behaviors that come from within rather than being forced. Here's an interesting definition by Merriam-Webster. It's the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, the thoughts, and experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So what does all of this mean? Empathy really means understanding the world through the eyes of another created being. You're trying to experience the world from another's perspective, right? So it's not just limited to my perspective. So I want us to think about how we show up, but then how other people show up and try to actually understand the perspective of another. What is empathy not? We talk about what empathy is. Empathy is not agreement. So when I say that I empathize with you, it's not saying that I agree. It's not saying that I am justifying your position. It's not necessarily even saying that I support it, that I encourage it, or that I approve of it. It's simply saying that I understand the world, or I'm attempting to understand the world and understand this particular issue from your perspective. Now, this concept of hermeneutical empathy, again, this is a term I coined. It gets to a little bit more deeper empathy. So it's understanding what I call the worldview behind the worldview. What has influenced or shaped the person's perspective? So it's one thing to understand how a person is actually seeing the world. It's another thing to understand why they see the world the way that they do, right? People can come to the same conclusion for largely different reasons. They can show up in similar ways for largely different reasons, right? Even when we talk about the Enneagram, people can behave in very similar ways for very different reasons. And it's really important to understand what's actually influencing someone behind the scenes. What has influenced or shaped that person's perspective, right? Everything going on behind the scenes again. The how and the why of how people are forming their thoughts, their being, their way of understanding and knowing the world. These are kind of the deeper aspects of empathy that we should try to get to understand. So a couple of other considerations that we'll talk about, and they'll come up more in the conversation. Sensitivity. I want us to be mindful that we need to be sensitive to these issues, right? Mental health is a sensitive topic. And so we are responsible to be sensitive. And what do I mean by that? Just having care and concern for what another person is saying, for what another person is feeling, and being, sensitive to those things. Responsibility. So recognizing that we have some responsibility in this conversation. I have responsibility to care for my own mental health, and I have a responsibility when interacting with folks and maintaining their own mental health, right? There are some considerations that I have to be responsible for myself, and also how I approach other people and how I navigate my relationships with other people. So it's not just a conversation where I can be like, well, this is not my responsibility. We do bear responsibility in this. Boundaries, being mindful that everybody has their own individual boundaries, right? And it is not for us to necessarily understand those boundaries. It is for us to respect them, to honor them, to follow them, and to govern ourselves appropriately. And then finally, grace. We've talked about this a little bit. Recognizing that we are not perfect. We haven't been called to be perfect. That is okay. Thank God that we have not been called to be perfect. And we're going to make mistakes. That is okay again. But also understanding that we need to have grace in this conversation. We need to have grace to be able to show up authentically, and be able to be vulnerable, but also recognize that we are all human beings. So let's talk a little bit about spirituality, religion, and mental health. This is where I start to get really excited, because literally this is the intersection for where all of my personal passions come together. So let's reference, of course, because I'm a pastor, we're going to go back to scripture for a second. Let's reference some scripture and lay a foundation for this. This is where I start to preach a little bit. This might sound a little bit sermonic, so I apologize in advance. Let's go to Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40, and I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. So the scripture reads as this: but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question: Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Let's see if I can, there we go. So what's the claim here that I'm making? Claim number one, the greatest commandment is deeply concerned with mental health. When we start looking at this, I would argue that we cannot fully fulfill the greatest commandment without properly caring for our own mental health, or without being mindful of the mental health of others. So when we actually break down the scripture, we see three things, right? We see mind, which represents the thoughts. We see heart, which represents the feelings, and we see soul, which in the Greek was psyche. It's kind of the essence of a person. It's where we get the word psychology. Soul and psychology have been so tied when you look at the language. So it's the full essence of a person that is not always exposed. So claim two, our relationship to mental health actually speaks theologically, literally going to the greatest commandment. We have to take care of our mental health so that we can love God properly and love others properly. How we love ourselves is how we're going to show up in both of those relationships. So mental health, I would argue, is at the core of the greatest commandment. The two cannot be separated. What's going on inside of us is going to emanate from within us, and it's surely going to impact our world around us, the world that we experience and the world that others experience. And Jesus here is actually telling us, like, this is what I infer from it, that your mental health is important. It's going to impact how you relate to God, how you relate to yourself, and how you relate to other people. We're actually going to talk about some core relationships in a minute. And this goes back to my conversation around pastoral theology, bringing spirituality and religion in conversation with psychology. This is hugely significant, right? These are the two coming together in the scripture. And I think that's really significant, that the greatest commandment actually has to do with the topic that we're talking about today. So understanding the human in relation to the human web. So there's this concept of the human web, that to understand a person, you have to actually see the interconnected web which they exist, right? So it's not just an isolated person, but it's all the systems and all the factors that exist in the web that they live in. And this is really important to pastoral theology. Again, putting scripture, putting religion, putting spirituality in conversation with mental health. And final idea under this idea that the sacred and the secular should be kind of pulled apart. Here we do see that the sacred and the secular are actually quite intertwined, right? A lot of people would love to keep these two things separate, but as I would argue here in the scripture, we can't. Not for me coming as a Christian pastor who uses a sacred text such as the Bible as being integral to how I navigate the world. So questions, putting mental health into conversation with relationships. What are some of the questions that we should consider? I co-pastor a church, like I said here, called New Story. And at New Story, we refer to 4 core relationships. We talk about our relationship with self. We talk about our relationship with others. We talk about our relationship with the divine or God, the creator. And we talk about our relationship with creation. So what are some of the questions that get us thinking about our mental health and put mental health in conversation with these core relationships? So let's talk about relationship to self. What are some of the questions that I can think about in starting to put mental health in relationship to my relationship with myself? So let's talk about some of these things. How do I feel about myself? This is actually getting to like, when I look in the mirror, what do I see? Do I shame myself? Do I look at myself from a lens of shame, or do I actually see the imago Dei? Do I see myself as created with the goodness and bearing the image of God? How does my mental health impact the way that I treat myself? Again, do I come from a perspective of shame? Do I treat myself from a perspective of shame? Or do I come at it with a positive perspective? What am I experiencing behind the scenes? What is it? What is going on that no one else can see? My relationship to myself. Do I have positive or negative self-talk? These are some of the questions that we can consider, again, when talking about our relationships to ourselves. The next one, relationship to others. How does my mental health affect my relationships? How are we actually reflecting on it? Does it affect my relationships? How have I approached the mental health of others? How have I actually paid attention to the mental health of others? Do I create safe spaces for others to be vulnerable? I would argue that we have to be intentional about interacting with others in a way that allows them to show up authentically in our relationships with them, in hopes that they would do the same for us. Mental health in conversation with our relationship with others. Relationship to the divine. What does this mean for our relationship to the divine, to God, to creator? How does God see me? How many times have we actually sat down to think about how God views me? What theological or spiritual messages have I been told about my humanness or my humanity, which has a significant impact? My spiritual health has a significant impact on my mental health, right? Being a queer woman, like the messages that I have heard about being queer is going to naturally impact my mental health. I can tell you, when I came out personally, I participated in an ex-gay ministry I was asked to by my church, and it significantly negatively impacted my mental health. That action alone, right? It sent me down a spiral. And I'm sure some of us listening today can relate to that. Do I come from a place where I focus so much on a sin-based concept or shame-based concept of sin, right? How does sin enter this conversation? Is it shame-based as being destructive, or is it relationship-centered, where I can actually look at it as restorative, right? This idea, this difference between shame and guilt. There is a difference. Shame is I'm ashamed of who I am. Guilt is I feel remorse for what I have done. Those are two different things. Do we have a concept of sin that is shame-based, or does it focus on relationship-centered? We go back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis. Before the fall, the two were naked and unashamed. The original sin that I would argue is to reject the inherent goodness of creation and then make attempts to fix it. What if we saw sin and evil sin and evil, quote unquote, as that which distorts and harms healthy relationships, right? This begins to move away from a shame-based model and really towards a relational model, right? And it puts some responsibility on us to approach our relationships in that way. Perhaps sin in relationship to mental health is not humanizing ourselves or others and then acting from a dehumanizing way. So reframing this conversation around sin and theology in our relationship to the divine. Finally, our relationship to creation, not just humanity. What is my relationship to the rest of creation? Not just other humans. Do I desire to see all of creation flourish or just myself or my group? This is a big conversation in the context of the United States, right? Where we're so focused, there's a lot of nationalist conversation, so focused on ourselves, right? Do I actually want to see all of creation flourish or is it just for myself? I want to challenge us to consider how our mental health might actually impact the world around us on a micro and a macro scale. All right, so we're going to go into activity 1. So now we're going to talk about mental health and our personal relationships. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 different relationships. So now we talked about the core relationships. We're going to distinguish personal relationships and professional relationships. This is kind of meat and potatoes, right? So now we're actually going to get the nitty gritty of like, what does this actually mean for my personal relationships? And what are some implications for professional relationships? Now be mindful, this is not exhaustive. We could probably write a dissertation on the role of mental health in our relationships, right? We're here for 90 minutes, so we're not going to do that, but we're going to talk about something. So, oops, hold on. Attachment style. How many of you all, well, I can see hopefully with your raise of hands, have heard of attachment style? Yeah, maybe give me some little affirmation. Everybody's heard of attachment style, or some people have heard of attachment style, right? So one thing that I will say, like as we go through some of these things, I personally believe in utilizing whatever is useful and helpful for myself, for my clients, for my congregants, and those with whom I am in close personal relationships. So I'm going to go through a couple of things for us to consider when we're actually thinking about our personal relationships. One that is hugely significant and beneficial that I would argue is attachment style. Understanding one's attachment style, how I attach to other people and how they attach to me. So when we talk about attachment style, we have 2 different types of attachment styles, main types. Secure, which is about 50% of the population, healthy attachment styles. And then we have insecure. Under the insecure, I think I have, oh, that's the next slide, next point. So under insecure, we have 3 subtypes. Anxious, which is designated by a fear of abandonment, need for safety, lower self-esteem, but higher regard for others. So it's an anxious, insecure attachment style. Then we have a dismissive, avoidant attachment style. Dismissive avoidants tend to believe that relationships will somehow disappoint them. They're fearful and skeptical of emotional intimacy and vulnerability. They need independence and they don't like relying on other people, again, because they feel that those relationships will ultimately disappoint them. They have a higher positive regard for themselves, at least on the surface, but not necessarily that for others. So high positive regard for self, not necessarily a high positive regard for other people. Then you have what's called fearful, avoidant, or disorganized attachment style. This is actually the rarest, and I will self-disclose that this has historically been my attachment style. So typically what happens with this attachment style is it's a mix of anxious and dismissive. So for most of us who have this particular attachment style, we typically had a caregiver that was dually the source of both trauma and healing. So the person who was the source of my trauma was also the person that I had to turn to in some cases for healing and to depend on, right? So I cultivate this really ambivalent relationship with intimacy and relationships. So I often experience, like this conflict in my relationships and react out of ambivalence. Another thing to consider in mental health and relationships is a family of origin. What do we mean when we talk about family of origin? So thinking about things like when I'm interacting with somebody or thinking about myself, like how did they grow up, right? Sometimes knowing how a person grew up can put things into perspective for us. Again, it's not just about mental illness. All of these things impact mental health, whether there's a diagnosable or diagnosed mental illness or not. We can still seek to understand these things. Did they have secure attachments, going back to attachment style? Did they have a healthy development? Were there things that impacted their development? Is there a history of trauma, abuse, neglect? This is a touchy one, but did they grow up in more of a place of privilege, or was potentially their upbringing in a place of poverty, right? Like I had a mix of both growing up. Like I had some privilege, but then for a large portion of my life, I lived in what most people would consider poverty. That can impact not only mental health, but our relationships with each other. And then big one, relationships to caregivers and other family members. Sometimes you will literally see people recreate dynamics in your relationship that they had in relationships with their family members. I'm sure some of us are thinking about some of these relationships right now, right? I saw a head nod. Yeah, see, yeah, right? We can think about these things, right? There's some type of, and I know this word is loaded, but like brokenness, there's something that happened in a core relationship. And I have to fix that now in my relationship. So I respond out of that now in my relationships with other people. Again, thinking about family of origin. Other considerations. So tools for understanding personal relationships. I love some of these, right? I put them in my bio. Enneagram. I'm a big Enneagram person. Enneagram has perhaps been one of the most beneficial tools for me in understanding myself and understanding my relationships to other people, but then understanding their relationship to me. Enneagram is huge, and it'll show up even when we talk about professional relationships. Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is helpful for understanding what we do, but I like the Enneagram over Myers-Briggs because Enneagram tells us why we do what we do, right? So Myers-Briggs, ENFJ, this is how I behave. Enneagram, 1, I behave this way because of a reason, right? There is actually a core motivation. There are reasons for why I behave the way that I do. Understanding, I mean, I can hear somebody tell me a number and I'm like, oh, things are starting to make a little bit more sense, right? Life path. This is something that I've recently got into or learning more about. And astrology. To some people, again, like these are important things. Like I've literally, if I hear one more person tell me all of the awful things that a Gemini has done to them, we just seem to be like the most hated sign, right? That has also impacted my mental health. Like I've gotten to the point where I just want to ask people, like when I meet them, like what Gemini hurt you? Just tell me up front, we can get it out of the way. Tell me what Gemini hurt you. We can get that out and then we can move forward with our lives, right? So some of this stuff can be helpful. Where I would caution us, don't pigeonhole people. While these tools can be useful, they can be very not helpful when you begin to use them in ways that actually pigeonhole people and don't allow people to be people. Don't allow people to show up authentically in ways that might actually surprise you. So you hear somebody and they're like, I'm a Virgo, or I'm an Enneagram 8, or all of these things, and all of a sudden you have made up your mind what that means. Or you get to the point where you're starting to understand and conceptualize even their mental health based on all of these things in such a rigid way, right? So they can be useful tools, but they're not the law. So again, use them, let them be as useful as they are useful in your actual life, but do not pigeonhole people because that can be very destructive to the mental health of another person, and it can be destructive to your relationship. Generally speaking, so this is an important thing to consider. Generally speaking, if they could, they probably would. What do I mean by this? Mental health and mental illness oftentimes are not things that we just snap our fingers and control it, right? So this idea, like for many of us, if I could control my depression, I would. Most of them, right? Like if I could with it, if I could, outside of medication or whatever, like if I could just wake up one day and like it be gone, like I would do that, right? So understanding that it's not a matter of like personal choice. People don't just decide to have mental health issues or mental illness. That is not how we should approach this conversation. So when that comes up, we talk about things that are unhelpful in this conversation and things that are helpful. So what are some unhelpful approaches? Some of you might have heard these things before. Just cheer up. Stop worrying so much. It could be worse. I hate that one. Literally hate that. I was stressed out about something the other day, still emotionally reeling in some degree over a situation, a relationship that ended. And I was talking to a friend about it and they were like, well, that relationship's over, so it's not for you to worry about. I was like, oh, like that doesn't really help. It will all get better, sometimes this comes in the form in the church, I'll pray for you. Like, just trust God, right? It'll all work out. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when you don't cheer up? What happens when the worry doesn't go away? Or it doesn't get better, it actually gets worse. These are unhelpful ways to approach others who are having mental health issues. Another one, ultimatums, punishment, stonewalling, withholding. We don't punish people. That is not going to correct behavior, right? I'm going to punish you out of your mental health issues. Some of us have probably been on the receiving end of this, right? You are acting up and I'm going to respond accordingly and I'm going to punish you relationally until you begin to act right. Again, if people could, then they would. This is not a choice type of approach, right? We're not talking about choice here. So on the contrary side of that, what's helpful and life-giving? Saying something like, what do you need or want from me in this moment? Asking somebody, recognizing that they're the expert of themselves. And even if it's not a big answer, they can probably tell you in that moment, right? I just need to be left alone, right? Actually getting to and giving them some agency and letting another person self-actualize in their particular space, right? Where they are at in relation to their mental health can be very humanizing, very dignifying. What do you want or need? Not necessarily for me, or what do you want or need in this moment? What do you want or need? How can I best support you? Right? Redirecting and not making it a matter of us, but making it a matter of them. Like, this is the person going through something and I want to support them. How can I best support you? Another question, have I said or done anything that has been harmful or unhelpful? Getting to ways that we have actually maybe contributed, right? Or negatively impacted the mental health of another person. And this is a big one. This is big for me. Apologize and correct your behavior when you have committed a reasonable offense. Some people may say like something that you've done that is not reasonable, right? But if you recognize like this is a reasonable offense, apologize and correct your behavior. It will go a very long way with most people. Questions that I always ask my clients when thinking about their personal relationships. What do I want from my relationships, both romantic and non-romantic? Are my actions reflecting these desires? Where have I faltered? What have I done well? At the end of this, it really comes down to, if these relationships matter to us, then we owe the relationship truth, authenticity, care, and love. What do I want out of this relationship? And am I approaching this relationship in a way that actually reflects what I want? Have I done something to negatively impact it? And have I done something to positively impact it? So now we're going to talk about mental health in professional settings. This gets tricky, but this is fun. This is interesting. And we'll do this briefly. So one thing, mental illness and mental health records are HIPAA protected information in your professional settings. HIPAA protected information is confidential and cannot be disclosed without proper consent of the individual, which means typically a consent to release information. So just because your coworker said that they have depression does not mean that you can go tell your other coworker that they have depression. That is protected information. This happens all the time just because people don't know, but this is not information that we should be sharing. Mental illness and mental health records are protected information. It's not mandatory to disclose mental health information or diagnoses at work. You do not have to do that. You should not ask others about their HIPAA protected mental health information, and others should not be asking you about yours. These are not conversations that we can just go asking people and that people can ask us. So if someone asks you, hey, do you have depression? Like, not appropriate. We can't do that at work. When disclosed to the appropriate officials, such as your supervisor or HR, this information is still protected, meaning if I tell my supervisor can't go gossip. Your employer has a legal obligation to protect this information. If you're an employer, know that you have a legal obligation to protect this information. So why should we disclose? Some of the reasons. Mental illness offers protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, American Disabilities Act. This provides necessary accommodations to help you, such as FMLA, short and long-term disability, alternating work arrangements or alternative work arrangements and assignments. So it can be helpful. Again, you need to determine for yourself if this is something that you need to disclose in your workplace so that you can actually get the help that you need. Mental health has the capacity to impact work dynamics, team building, morale, productivity, and employment. What this really comes down to, it comes back to the conversation about responsibility. Generally speaking, it's our responsibility to exercise self-awareness, manage our own mental health, seek help when we need it, and treat others according to the law and with sensitivity in mind. It has the ability to impact so many dynamics, so we have to take it seriously, whether we're the ones dealing with mental health or whether we know somebody else at work is dealing with mental health concerns. General tip, this is really helpful. If you are unsure, ask your HR. You should all have HR departments. If you are unsure, can I say this? Can I ask this? Do I have to disclose this? Ask your HR. They're a team of professionals who are supposed to know the law. They're supposed to know how these things work. If you are unsure, ask your HR in relationship to mental health or any type of like protected information, health related. Again, appropriate tools, these show up all the time. So if you work in a space, if you're an employer or your employee, these can be helpful tools in terms of understanding dynamics. And a lot of these have now been reframed to understand them in a work dynamic situation. So they have like Enneagram tools just for work scenarios, how this shows up in the professional setting. Myers-Briggs, the Keirsey temperament sorter, emotional intelligence test. There are some ways where we can actually incorporate mental health in a healthy, appropriate way in our work settings. Again, this doesn't mean that you have to disclose stuff, but this can be helpful if you are willing to participate. So let's again talk about unhelpful, unlawful approaches and helpful, lawful approaches. Some unhelpful ones. Do not ask your coworkers if they're depressed. Not helpful, not appropriate. Don't say things like, do you really even want this job? Not helpful, not appropriate. I've heard things like this before, right? And the list goes on and on and on. So really be mindful of how we're approaching our coworkers, how we're approaching our employees. Helpful or more lawful and appropriate ways to approach some of this. So if you're a supervisor saying something like, I've noticed that you seem to be struggling a bit lately with your work. Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. You see how that's a much more humanizing approach than like, do you want this job? Now you're putting it back on the actual work. Like, hey, I've noticed this is impacting your work. I just want to make sure that you're okay. Supervisor, again, are there any ways that we can better support you with your tasks? From a coworker's perspective, encourage others in the things that they have done well. For example, research has shown that positive reinforcement delivers the best results in behavior. So reinforcing what things have done well. Encourage folks. Encouragement can go a long way when we have conversations around mental health. So we'll skip this activity for the end for the sake of time. I'm going to go into implications of identity. We can come back to it. We can add that final question or that activity to the final discussion questions we'll get to in just a second. So implications of identity in this conversation, and this is the last thing that we will discuss. So marginalization, we talk about this, marginalization, discrimination, oppression, and disenfranchisement. These all are oftentimes used interchangeably, but they have slightly different definitions and functions. And I would highly encourage everyone to look up the actual definitions of these. But marginalization, for example, how do you actually, where are you situated in terms of power and what we call hegemony, right? There's a dominant culture. Where am I situated in position to that dominant culture? Am I in the dominant culture or am I at the margins? Discrimination and disenfranchisement kind of go hand in hand, right? These are actual actions. Like, what actions have been taken against me? In what ways have I been denied access based on my identity as a marginalized person? And oppression. Again, this is like a larger term for acts of discrimination and disenfranchisement. So just understanding how they're sometimes used interchangeably, but they correlate and are a little bit different. Intersectionality. This is an interesting one. Everybody has different concepts for what intersectionality means. Originally, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, some of you know this, in 1989 to describe the unique but interconnected discrimination that Black women faced in their identities as both Black and women. So it wasn't just about one identity, it's the intersection of those two identities and the discrimination, the unique discrimination that they face because of both of those things. The Center for Intersectional Justice definition is really interesting. They describe it in this way. The concept of intersectionality describes the ways in which systems of inequality based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, identity, disability, class, and other forms of discrimination intersect to create unique dynamics and effects. All forms of inequality are mutually reinforcing and must be therefore analyzed and addressed simultaneously to prevent one form of inequality from reinforcing another. So it's the interplay between all of the forms of discrimination working with one another. For example, when understanding my mental health and the way my identity impacts it, one must consider how me being Black, a woman, and queer create an interconnected form of marginalization that are inextricably tied to one another. So you can't see it outside of one of those identities. You have to see how they're all interworking together. So considerations for identity, especially intersectionality when addressing mental health, require greater sensitivity. It's not another person's job to educate me on the experiences of marginalized peoples. Greater sensitivity means more education, more research, knowledge, and listening. We have to listen, we have to educate ourselves, we have to do our own work. And while it's helpful, it is helpful to familiarize ourselves with issues pertaining to mental health and mental illness as these issues arise in our lives. Again, we should be responsible. We have to take some ownership and responsibility. It's not just about everyone else doing the work. We have to do the work as well. So now we can stop the presentation again and we'll go into some scenarios. Thank you all again if you're watching. Thank you for watching my presentation. I appreciate it.